air. Now we are live. I can go back to that. So my natural tendency as a presenter is to wander all over the room. I'm going to try not to do that so that my audio actually gets picked up for the Google Hangout Live. So if I look like I'm trapped here in the corner, that's why. So I'm going to talk today about design from the content out. It's a bit of a sort of philosophical talk about design more than a practical talk. That's something that I have a habit of doing. It probably comes from having done a PhD in the humanities before I became a web person. So I like to think about history of design from a slightly different perspective. This is the panorama of the city of New York at the Queens Museum of Art. It's a really wonderful thing to go see if you're ever in the area. And the reason that I want to, oh, sorry, I got to turn my remote on for that to work. The reason that I want to bring it up today is to talk a little bit about urban planning as a model for web design. This is the only inappropriate language in the presentation, I promise. Urban planning has a very sort of long history of the struggle between order and disorder, the struggle between centrally planned regular efficiency and local habit, right? The Boston streets on the bottom are ideally, are outside a grid, chaotic. It's often very difficult because Boston has, like, for example, Cambridge Street. There are 4 different Cambridge streets at different parts of Boston, and if you don't know that, they don't connect to each other and they're not the same street at all. So you have to know whether you want the one in Allston or the one in South Boston. So this is Georges Haussmann, sometimes called Baron Haussmann, though he never actually got the title. And Haussmann worked with Napoleon in the mid-19th century to renovate Paris, right? So Paris, as it headed into the mid-19th century, was struggling with rapid chaotic growth, was struggling with inefficient sewer systems, transportation systems, etc. And Haussmann basically becomes the core figure of heavy centralized city planning, right? Carves out the boulevards, literally tearing down buildings, vitiating slums, displacing hundreds of thousands of people, but creates this wonderful Paris that we have today with the broad boulevards, dramatically improves the sewer system, dramatically improves the transportation system, but in the same way as, and there's a interesting kind of debate in the academic community about whether this was also a way of getting rid of the revolutionary barricades, right? That this sort of made it much more efficient for the Paris police to remove the communards. If you are a fan of Victor Hugo, you may remember some of those scenes. So this is Place de l'Opéra. This is a painting from Pissarro, or Avenue de l'Opéra. And these buildings that you see are called Haussmann buildings or Haussmann architecture. Uniform height, uniform facade to the street, uniform color. It's this very much this kind of imposed central planning to create a beautiful space. And that makes Haussmann kind of the spiritual ancestor of both people like Frederick Law Olmsted, who you may know from Central Park, as well as the park system in Boston, and Swampscott, the town right next to where I live in Massachusetts, which was an old Olmsted planned community. The City Beautiful movement, as well as the kind of centralized planning of people like Robert Moses. So these two, this is Jane Jacobs on the left and Robert Moses on the right. As I was preparing this talk, and I was actually thinking about Jane Jacobs and Robert Moses and sort of the fight between them, and then I discovered there's actually now an opera, MosesJacobsOpera.com, in development now about the struggle between Moses and Jacobs in the 50s and 60s in New York. But effectively, and this is a little bit of a caricature or exaggeration of their difference, but it's helpful. You know, Moses was all about sort of centralized control, was willing to dislocate neighborhoods, was willing to mow down whole parts of the city in order to build expressways, very much favored sort of the car and the automobile version of the city, and sort of was willing to tear down large blocks in order to do it. He said, if somebody can show me a way to get rid of ghettos without breaking any, or without displacing any people, I'll show you someone who could make an omelet without breaking eggs, right? Like he was one of those kinds of central boss figures who had that approach. Jacobs, on the other hand, in her great book, The Death and Life of Great American Cities, talked about a more bottom-up version of city planning and talked about there's a quality even meaner than outright ugliness or disorder. It's the dishonest mask of pretend order. achieved by ignoring or suppressing the real order that is struggling to exist and be served. And so I'm going to argue that web design has this same tension between a kind of centralized top-down version of design that gives the designer control and a recognition of a more bottoms-up, more chaotic, more flexible, more difficult way to deal with design. So if the representative of design here, Victor Papnik, design is the conscious attempt to oppose a meaningful order, right? We take chaos, we take random fragments, we take all of these various things, and we use design as a way of trying to piece together a sort of totalizing vision, or a gestalt, or a sort of holistic view of what's going on. When it comes to web design, though, I would argue we're doing it wrong, right? Our metaphor of the page, we have two primary metaphors of the web, pages and sites. Right? The page is fundamentally broken as a metaphor because it assumes a fixed canvas. It comes from 600 years of book publishing and even scrolls and manuscripts before that. It comes from the idea that there's one fixed realization of the page that can't be changed except by expensive resetting and new additions. The site metaphor is wrong in the sense that a site isn't a place that we go to and explore. It isn't an actual physical space. It's a digital manifestation that might exist, that same content might exist in multiple places at once, right? It assumes the laws of actual property in the physical world where things can only exist in one place at a time. We've been doing it wrong for some time, right? This isn't a new thing. In fact, I would argue we've been doing it wrong for a very long time, probably for the last 15 years. The very early web pages, you can take the launch web page from CERN today and it's mobile friendly and works on any device and it's fantastic and easy to use and wonderful. Now you might argue it's not well designed and we could have a discussion about that, but at least it's fundamentally cross-device. It's easier to take a site that was built before 2006 and make it responsive or make it better designed than it is to take most sites that were designed between say 2006 and now that are in that pixel perfect table layout, fixed page mode, and bring them into the present. So John Alsop wrote famously the Tao of web design in 2000, right? It's amazing to me that this article was published in May of 2000 and we're still trying to get the core point that Alsop made. Now is the time for the medium of the web to outgrow its origins in the printed page, not to abandon that, but to chart its own course and learn from those lessons, right? The web's greatest strength is often seen as a limitation, as a defect. That is its lack of control for the designer. Why can't I make this page look the same for everybody? Why can't I control the layout? Why can't I control what device people use to access my site? Why can't I force them to use the browser that I like and not the browser that they like? It is the nature of the web to be flexible, and it should be our role as designers and developers to embrace this flexibility. So what does that mean in practical terms? Well, responsive design is part of the answer, right? Ethan Marcotte's article and then book and now podcast and webinar series and all of the other things. Ethan is a fantastic speaker. If you ever get a chance to see one of his talks, please do. He really has a fundamental understanding of this nature of the flexibility of the web. And that's been part of the answer. Though we've tended to kind of fall back to arguments about media queries and CSS and kind of miss the larger point in some cases, but it's definitely something we should be paying attention to. The other half of this dynamic duo that does the Responsive Web Design podcast, Karen McGrain, her book Content Strategy for Mobile. Content strategy is clearly part of the answer here too. The notion of structured content and adaptive content and the notion that you need to think about your content above the level of a single device, and then recognize that that content might have multiple manifestations in different places. What I'm suggesting we need to do is put them together and do what I call designing from the content out, right? This is inspired in part by Zeldman, who long, long ago said content precedes design. Design in the absence of content is not design, it's decoration. There's some disagreement about what exactly content precedes design or content first has to mean, and I'll talk a little bit about that, but the fundamental notion is that we shouldn't be designing in the absence of content. And then Stephen Hay from a great presentation, and I should have said I'll post these slides, and there are links in the slides to all the resources so you can find all these things, from BDConf, talked about the responsive workflow, and his answer is to design from the bottom up, which means from the content out. So there are kind of three threads that I'm going to talk about. One is designing with real content as opposed to fake content or no content. Second is designing from the bottom up as opposed to the top down. And the third is designing systems, not pages. I think these are three fundamental sort of shifts in direction that have to do with taking the way we've been thinking about design for the web and turning it upside down. So the first is to design with real content. If you can't tell from there, this is a Lego version of Times Square. So what do we do today when we do web design? A huge percentage of the time, we do lorem ipsum, right? So, or even worse, we do gray bars that are meant to represent text. I think it's time to kill lorem ipsum, right? And I know there are various pro and con arguments to the focus of lorem ipsum. Why is it a problem? It's synthetic content. People watch humans, these are synths, they're robots, they're not actually humans. They're get away with thinking about it as content, but it isn't real content. And the reason why that matters is that lorem ipsum is a convenient crutch because it fits wherever we ask it to, right? In our comps, our headlines are always exactly the right number of letters. They always fit exactly on one line or two lines where we expect them to. They're all the same height. They're all the same width. The list of people on the site is really just the same one or two people repeated over and over again. So they all have the same length name. They all have the same shaped photo. They all have the same tonality. All the images are the same. Either they're just gray boxes or they're placeholder images carefully chosen from a stock library. You know, once the site actually gets real content in it, it will never live up to the placeholder content. The placeholder content is uniform. The real content is lumpy, messy, uneven. It has the warp and weft of human experience in it. It is fundamentally different than placeholder content. Little side discourse on lorem ipsum. So lorem ipsum is not random. Like, it's not actually random text. It's actually a corrupted version of Cicero's De Finibus Bonorum and Malorum on the ends of good and evil from 45 BC. And the key part in the middle is this part that I've highlighted. Nor is there anyone who loves or pursues or desires to obtain pain of itself because it is pain, but because occasionally circumstances occur in which toil and pain can procure him some great pleasure. It's a discourse on hedonism. I like to imagine this is like the little hidden S&M moment in every website design. There's this weird, like, why are we doing Latin? I once was in a 3-day workshop reviewing a set of wireframes and comps with a major New England-based healthcare provider. And toward the end of day 3, a lovely marketing person that I worked with raised his hand and said, "Who's going to proofread all the Spanish?" And we all kind of said, "What Spanish are you talking about?" And he said, "Well, the Spanish that's in all these pages, the lorem ipsum dolores et amit," right? It confuses people. We have all seen, I'm sure, sites that go live that still have lorem ipsum in them, right? Because nobody has ever bothered to come back and correct it. So what do you do if your client doesn't yet have content? Well, the best answer I can give is you wait. We force clients to understand the reasons why we're asking the questions we are asking. If you haven't read Mike Montero's Design is a Job, go get it and read it. It's in the Book Apart series. There's a whole section on the way that we treat clients, how to treat us as designers. If we start without any sense of content or content structure or goals or audience, and we say that we can do design in the absence of all of those things, we train clients that those things don't matter, right? And so they're questions that aren't important. They don't have an impact. If you can't, then I suggest you use what we call proto content. And proto content is a phrase I'm grabbing from Travis Tots, who there's a talk that he gave at WordCamp Minneapolis called Design Better Websites with Content First. And he argues that there's these kind of 4 kinds of proto content that you can use. So if you're doing a redesign, use the site's current content, right? Yes, it will force the people at the client or within your team who are supposed to write the content to scream and yell and say, "Oh my God, what are you doing? We hate the current content." But force that to happen, right? It's at least the best likely representative of the kind of content they're going to produce in the future. People like to imagine that doing a redesign is going to somehow fundamentally shift their editorial process or their content production process and make them suddenly better at writing content, and that's not realistic, right? So start with the site's own content as a kind of prototype. Just like we prototype other parts of the experience, we can have proto content that has content-like features to it. It's not lorem ipsum. It's got the lumpiness. It's got the real limitations of real content. But it's also throwaway, right? So it's prototype. It's not what's actually going to launch with the site. Second option is write your own. One of my mentors used to always say, he who gets to paper first wins, right? Whenever you're in a negotiation or you're planning an event or you're working with a group of people, the first person to actually write down a plan is driving the conversation, because then everybody else reacts, right? So sketching out your own content can be a very good way to drive this. In an agency environment or in an environment where you're getting paid for specific tasks and not other tasks, this obviously can be problematic, but sometimes it's better than nothing. Third option, use text from competitors' websites. This is perhaps the most controversial suggestion. I actually think it's brilliant. I think Travis is very smart for suggesting this. If you're in a space where there are some existing other sites that are in that same competitive space, prototype with their content. Obviously, you have to proceed with caution here. You're breaking copyright. You want to make sure that you don't go live with that content. There's all kinds of other things to worry about. But nothing will get your client more quickly to say, oh, that's not our message, this is, than seeing their competitors' content, right? That's a really striking way to get them to do it. All else fails, use fake content or real content, but from another context, right? At least real content in the language that you're going to use will have some of the warp and weft of real content. Find something that has headings and subheads and has pull quotes in it, right? And has some images in it and whatever sort of matches the kind of content you're going to have. And at least that will be better than repeating lorem ipsum delorsit omit 1,000 times, right? And having all of your sentences be identical. Corollary to this, 1A is design with real content, including the ads. So I work at 10up, a lot of sites that are advertising monetized. Sometimes we are controlling the design process. Sometimes we are getting design from other firms. I cannot tell you when we get design from other firms how often we get designs that don't have ads in them. And then we have to say, you do realize the way this site makes money is through those ads that are inserted into your designs. If you don't design for them, you will retrofit them later, and I can guarantee it will be less effective. I also suggest design with real ads, because the next best thing that a designer will be prone to do is make ads that are all beautiful. They're elegant, they're sparse, there's no animation, it's an Audi or an expensive Mac on a field of white, and the real ad is gonna be, you know, punch the monkey and win an iPad, and it's gonna be jumping out and making noise and animated. Get as close to the real kinds of ads that run on the site as you can, because that's what you're actually designing for. You're designing for reality, not the fake ad. Second major thing is design from the bottom up. So websites are built and are designed typically from the top down, and they're experienced from the bottom up. What do I mean by that? I mean, we tend to start with the home page on desktop, right? Let's take the biggest page we can imagine that has the most political attention to it. That's why we have to have a carousel, because everybody wants everything on the home page. And then we'll go to section pages or section fronts or topic pages or whatever the next level down is. And lastly, we'll get to the sort of content detail page. But the reality is most of your users are coming into a content detail page, right? Think about the way you actually use the web. How often are you going to a browser and typing in a domain name from scratch? Most of the time you're coming from search, you're coming from social, you're coming from an email newsletter, you're coming from somewhere else, and you're going to a detailed level page. 90% of the pages on the site are detailed pages, right? That's why sitemaps usually have a couple of things at the top, and then they have that big stack that, like, this represents the 600,000 articles that we have. So why are we spending all of our time designing the homepage and then only later getting down to the article page? Start from the article and work your way back up. Also, start from mobile and work back up to desktop, right? Because the mobile experience, and I really mean phone here, right? Start at the smallest breakpoint for which you're going to design, is going to force the right kind of category decisions and prioritization decisions to be made that then can be applied as you go back up to desktop. Now, one of the challenges we have had with some clients is clients aren't ready for this shift, and they want to see the homepage first, and they want to see the homepage on desktop. If you can manage it, do the deliverables in the order that makes sense to you, and present them in the order that makes sense to the client. There is a risk there in that you've already done more work, and if the desktop goes in the wrong direction, you're gonna have some more redirection to go. But I think you will actually get the desktop right more often if you start from mobile and work in that direction than in the opposite way, right? We try to do this at the wireframe stage and again when we're in design. Again, with real content, not fake content. 3, design systems, not pages. So we tend, when we do design, to think about a totality. We are still thinking of the web as a page or a poster that we are then going to slice up, right? We're still slicing in Photoshop into little bits. So we design as a coherent whole, and then we cut up into little bits. The page is actually going to be assembled by your front-end engineer or by yourself if you're the one who does it, from smaller components up into bigger components, right? We need to think in terms of systems. And this is a flock of starlings. The rules for flocking birds are absurdly simple. I don't know if you've ever seen the screen simulators that do this same kind of motion. The rules are separation, alignment, and cohesion. So don't get too close to the bird next to you that you will interfere with his or her ability to fly. Otherwise, steer toward where everybody else seems to be going and steer toward the average position of neighbors so that you don't get too far away. So get as close as you can without violating rule number 1, is the way this is often phrased. Creates a beautiful system out of a small set of rules that every component in the system operates on, right? Web design is less like building a page and more like trying to plan a city, right? It's less top-down and centralized and more bottom-up. How do we go about doing that? Style tiles was the first kind of leap in this direction for me. I've spent the last 15, 16 years in agency work driving design and development projects in the content management space. Style tiles, it's styletile.es, so if you just put a period before the ES, that's the site. Came out of the Drupal community, was a first sort of attempt at saying, instead of designing a whole page, let's think about small style elements. Let's go from a mood board to a style tile. And a style tile has typography. It has kind of, here's what a headline looks like and a subhead and a lead. It has some notion of the kinds of photography or the kinds of imagery that's going to be used on the site. It has a sense of color palette. And it has a sense of sort of scale and proportion. But it's not a page. And it's sort of like you've taken a page comp and exploded it into a million pieces. That's how we first approach style tiles. I think it's actually more important to say we never built the page in the first place. We started with the smaller components, and then we're going to assemble them into a page at a later point in the process. Some other design systems that are getting a lot of attention right now, things like Google's material design. Now, whatever you think of material design, and I think the most important thing we can say about material design is they've done a fantastic job marketing it, right? Just to say they've gotten a hell of a lot of people talking about material design, probably way more in excess of its actual value to application developers, but that's okay. That's a good thing for design. You know, a whole coherent system all the way down to the kind of let's take pictures of cards stacked with a camera and measure the shading that they throw off so that we're based in something true and material and physical, right? But it's not just this top-down think about the page. It's also all the way down into what are the components and patterns and how do these components interact with each other. So rather than thinking about design as my goal is to look at a blank page and produce this work of art, right? Blank canvas and I make something beautiful out of it. And more the assembly metaphor, more the composer who is writing individual lines for individual instruments and then is pulling them all together into an orchestration at the end. This one doesn't show as well on the map, but it's Uber's design system from, I think it's brand.uber.com. It's, again, a way of saying there are sort of visual identity elements, but then there are also application interaction elements and how they interact with each other and how they're intended to be used. So that instead of starting when you're designing a new experience from the blank page, you're starting from a set of components that you can assemble, and then you're tweaking and growing from there. The fullest kind of realization of this design system approach that I'm familiar with is Brad Frost and his book Atomic Design, which he'll note is/will be a book. It's in the process of development now. You can read it now. The first couple of chapters are up and readable. You can pre-order it for $10. If you don't know Brad Frost, he's an incredible forward thinker. I think he's doing a lot of really interesting work about how this will operate. And the metaphor that he's using is chemistry, right? This is why it's atomic design, because you start with atoms that are built up into molecules that become part of organisms, and then those organisms are formed into templates. And then pages are used to compare the templates, or compare how the components actually work with the way they were designed. So this is what he calls a page. Now, he says this is real content, but I love that then there are all these placeholder contents. Drives me crazy. And his point is, once you've done this sort of atomic identification, what does a headline look like? Then there's a sort of molecule. What does a headline look like with a subhead under it? Or what does a label and an input look like? But then the molecule is when you put together the label for search and the input for search. And then you go on up, the organism is sort of what the whole search box looks like in the top nav. And then the whole template is how does a page get assembled from all these pieces. Once you have that template, then you create pages, which are actual instances of the templates. So it's a very, in some ways, a developer-centric way of thinking. This is like an abstract class and its concrete instantiation, right? The template is the sort of abstract Platonic ideal of a page, and the page is meant to be the real thing. And by switching between the page and the design system, you can test the effectiveness of the underlying design system. It's at the page stage that we're able to take a look at how all these patterns hold up when real content is applied. So instead of doing the traditional mode, which is I'm going to design the static page and then I'm going to cut it up into little pieces, coming from the bottom up and thinking about a design system means I'm going to design individual components and then I'm going to assemble them into pages. But if you design those individual components using placeholder content, and you then assemble them into templates using placeholder content, and you never do this kind of check of what happens when real content flows through this system, it's like designing a city plan without ever letting people into it, right? People are messy and uneven and do things that you don't expect and distort the plan and make changes that you can't predict. And editors are people too. They will do some of that. Brad, if you read him, quotes Mark Bolton, who is another great designer who talks about content structure. Mark Bolton is actually defending the use of lorem ipsum and says, we don't need to know what the final content is. We just need to know its structure. I think that's okay, but I think the reality is a content structure that's abstract never holds up to a content. We want to get some real sample content before we get too far into the system. Yeah.
And so I would ask also, do you do this in multiple languages, either running it through Google Translate to get German, to get Korean, to get...
if you think the thing that you are designing will eventually be done in multiple languages, absolutely. Sometimes that's one of those budget scope decisions where, like, ideally, I would love to do that for every site because I would think every site might at some point become multilingual. But obviously, that's going to cause trouble.
It can also expose, particularly with German and Finnish words, can expose all kinds of typographic swamps.
Absolutely, especially in things like navigation, right? The German, if you don't know it as a language, has these long cognated words that are 50 characters long and have no spaces or break in them, right? And they will destroy any navigation that expects to be a fixed width. If you can also then do simplified Chinese or Japanese, then you can sort of see the opposite because now you have a character instead of a word, so it sort of screws everything up in the opposite direction. Yeah, real language, multilingual, if it's applicable, right? Knowing that sometimes you don't know what's going to be applicable. So we need to see the forest, which is to say the gestalt overall view of the big picture, but we also need to see the trees, right? We need to be able to zoom back and forth between the two. And historically, I would argue what we do in web design is only the top down and not enough of the bottom up and thinking about how are all these individual components going to come together. And I would argue the reason that we do so is because we're control freaks, right? It's because it feels like control. It's what Jane Jacobs talked about as the order that's imposed that ignores the real order that's trying to emerge. It's that feeling of, look, I can make all the headings line up. I can make everything have exactly the right number of line breaks. I don't have to deal with the fact that sometimes that headline is going to be 3 lines long and I haven't set line height appropriately because I ignored that because I was using lorem ipsum and it all fit. I can ignore the fact that sometimes the articles have a thumbnail and sometimes they don't, and sometimes that thumbnail has text in it. I can't put a headline over. I can deal with the fact that sometimes it's heavy and dark and sometimes it's light and airy, right? I get away from all of those things by ignoring them. I love, this is also from Death and Life of Great American Cities, and she's talking about how pedestrians dance in the streets, how pedestrians create order. It's all composed of movement and change, and although it is life, not art, we may fancifully call it the art form of the city and liken it to the dance, an intricate ballet in which the individual dancers and ensembles all have distinct parts which miraculously reinforce each other and compose an orderly whole. If we design from the component level up, we have a chance to see how those components interact with each other with real content in them and adjust. And we go through that cycle multiple times, right? It's like a painter who is up close working on a painting and then steps back 25 feet to see the composition, and then goes close again, and then goes back again. And we should go back and forth between those things regularly. I think actually, even if you are a traditionally trained designer who wants to start with blank canvas in Photoshop, start with a very small canvas and make some of those components independent of your bigger page first, because it actually changes the way you're conceiving of it and thinking about what you're trying to do. And it makes you think about these small pieces that are going to be assembled rather than only thinking about the totality. You will always get a chance to see it all come together, right? I'm not suggesting we ignore the big picture or we don't get a chance to think about it as a whole, but I am suggesting that the journey begins by letting go of control and becoming flexible, right? Allowing the content to drive and designing from the bottom up. So to recap, design with real content, not lorem ipsum. If you can't get real content, find ways to get proto content that acts as much like real content as possible. And remember, this includes the ads. Design from the bottom up. So start from the content detail, whatever content detail means in your context, on mobile, and build up to desktop on homepage. I think a lot of the fight over carousels, we typically like to blame the business for that and say, oh, I have to use a carousel because the business is fighting over who wants placement on the homepage. And yes, I know no one will ever click on the second, third, or fourth thing in that carousel, and it's a waste of time. And there's a great site called shouldiuseacarousel.com that will tell you all about that. The answer is no, always. The reason that that happens, I would suggest, is the design community's fault, not the business community's fault. It's because we're focused on the big picture on the homepage. It's because we're focused on the hero image. It's because we're focused on the impression that conveys. And we're thinking about one version of the homepage. And the reason there can be only one homepage is because we decided that, right? Now I know if you're working on some smaller, more static marketing microsites, maybe that landing page, that homepage is the URL that's going to be advertised in print or on TV or sent to people, and they might go to that homepage. I would argue that's the edge case on the web. Most of the time on the web, what we're talking about is really content detail pages driving the experience. And then design systems, not pages. Just thinking about what we're doing as designing a page as the guiding metaphor has been problematic from the beginning. If we go back to earlier models of graphic design, think about advertising and branding and identity design in the 50s and 60s, right? People thought about brand differently, and they designed brand identities that were systems of components that could be leveraged on the side of vans and in office decor and in advertising. We need to be thinking about our websites as systems of digital components that interact with each other rather than static pages, because they are no longer static pages in any sense. So this is me. I'm John Aikman. I'm the CEO at 10up. We are a full-service digital agency that does strategy, design, and engineering on open platforms, in particular WordPress. We are always looking to bring on board talented, smart people. So if you are looking for a job, please do come talk to me. Otherwise, I will take questions, if anyone has any. Yeah.
I was wondering if you, in your design meetings, if you go into use case terminology with your clients. Mm-hmm. It seems to me that I found that to be helpful. I may not call it a use case, right, but I will use that methodology because that helps us begin. Yep. You're telling them, you put away the desktop, let's talk about how will you use the system.
For most of our clients, if we get to actually mentioning UML, we have failed, right? So not use cases in the full-blown IEEE spec version. But personas and what are sometimes called, I'm going to blank on the name for them. They're more job-based use cases. So I need to use the site to accomplish this thing, right? And it's much more accomplishment-oriented, and I have a job to do, and that's why that happens. The great majority of our clients tend to be in either media and entertainment, so they're publishing content, or they're sort of brands who are acting like that, NGOs or universities or brands who have a lot of content to publish. So the use case metaphor I have found is less useful for us, because the use case is I need to get this content published, and that's just not very interesting, right? But diving back further to what is it we want to accomplish by publishing this content? So what is our call to action? We actually have, as part of our experience design team, a group we call Audience and Revenue Growth Strategy. And these are the folks who understand advertising and understand conversion rates and are always looking for what is the action we want the user to take on this page beyond the fact that they've experienced this great content. Is it read the 5 things that are recommended next? Is it sign up for the newsletter? Is it buy the thing, right? All of those can help also drive this conversation. But yes, definitely we start our experience design process as a whole before we even get to visual design with business goals, audiences, objectives, that whole structure. The content is in that structure. I think of it as what do we bring to the situation? So we have these objectives we want to accomplish. We have these audiences we want to reach. Content to me comes from the sort of like, what assets do we have to accomplish those goals? And it fits into the conversation from that perspective.
Okay, and then just to follow up on that.
Yeah.
Old SEO data, any analytics you have, I assume can be fairly effective in saying nobody is looking at this gallery. Yep. No one is looking at your page 37.
So both kind of the web analytics side, which is to say what pages are people actually clicking on, what flows are they actually going through, that every page is a landing page concept is always really helpful when I can say, okay, let's look at your traffic pattern and let's talk about what percentage of people ever saw the homepage and get used to that.
I had a client who was heartbroken because no one is looking at the 15-minute videos that she posted on her page.
I think the harder part is the conversation about, so what do we do with that fact, right? Is it because those videos suck, or is it because they're poorly surfaced, or is it a discovery problem, right? And that's an interesting thing to get into. Question in the front? Did you have one?
Well, I had a friend with an interesting experience, the concept of a metaphor. And they were actually developing an app, and the person whose company it was loved this idea of a drawer. And so all the developers developed this app with this little drawer that looked really cool when they did it. And then they used me as a guinea pig, and I'm looking at this thing going, I don't know what to do. Which was really just, I'm just trying to think about what you're talking about. Part of the whole thing about the metaphors, you got to get out of your your community to find out if your metaphor makes sense.
One of the classic examples from the early days of e-commerce was the sort of hooded sweatshirt versus hoodie, right? That sort of all the apparel companies were calling them hooded sweatshirts or hooded pullover sweatshirts, and then people were searching on hoodie and not finding them because that's not the language people actually use. So both the language and the metaphor has to make sense. A lot of this now is the talk about the so-called hamburger menu or the shish kebab menu, right? The hamburger is the 3 lines and the shish kebab is the 3 dots, and sort of, do people know what that means on a mobile site? And some people will say, yes, of course, everybody gets that. That's like click on the logo to go to the homepage. And then you say, well, have you ever actually user tested that? Because the reality is actually a lot of people don't know that and have no idea that your menu is hidden behind that 3 lines. And those people are now unable to use your site just because they didn't learn from Facebook the way you did what that's supposed to do, right? So a lot of people are now either replacing that with the word menu in a box or adding the word menu to it or doing other things to kind of highlight that there's stuff hidden there. But yes, absolutely, making sure that you understand your user's mental model. And I would argue even analysis of your own existing content and how it's been used helps you understand that user model in ways that looking at abstract, again, placeholder content doesn't, right? It keeps it more front of mind. Any other questions? Yeah.
Well, I just had a comment.
Sure.
That may provoke something else, but I really liked your point around forcing people to use their own content. And one of the reasons I like that so much is because essentially, if they don't have a good system for producing content regularly, the project's essentially going to, in my opinion, fail.
Yes.
Or if not fail, not live up to their expectations. And I think that's a major misconception people have because they think that maybe they've been sold a bill of goods on SEO or whatever it is, but they're just going to pay for this sexy new site and suddenly, voila, And the bottom line right now is that I had someone ask me the other day about, like, I have these great courses, what do I do? And I was like, well, he was asking for marketing advice. I was like, well, you have to create content around that. And he's like, well, I don't have time. And I'm like, well, you don't have time not to, because that is, that's all the marketing that you have.
Yeah, there's a great, I mean, y'all remember the old bumper sticker, education expensive, try ignorance, right?
Yes.
It's that same concept of, like, if you don't have time to write content, then you are going to fail. I mean, you need to figure that out. And as I was literally putting slides together for this yesterday, I had a call with one of our salespeople about a client prospect who had reached out to us. Wanted to kick off a project on September 21st, launch on December 1st, has zero content, is in parallel kicking off a marketing strategy to figure out what their content should be. And I'm like, how do you, I don't even, I mean, I understand how you get there from the sense that I understand how organizations can be dysfunctional, but at the same time, I don't understand how you actually expect that to succeed.
Yeah.
Because we're going to be doing design while somebody else is figuring out what the objectives and business goals and content are.
Right.
And then we're going to slam them together on just November 30th and think it will be effective, and it just doesn't work that way. So yeah, thinking very much about your current content and what is different now, organizational priorities, budget, right? What has changed that's going to make this time more successful than last time? Because design on its own isn't going to fundamentally solve that problem, right? As Karen McGrain is always saying, responsive design won't fix your content problem if you have a fundamental content problem. Great. Well, thank you all. I'm going to stop our hangout. And figure out whether